EVE Online really is a rabbit hole. The more I try and research this video game and its financial systems, the more stories the community in the game reach out to share with me. So far in this series, we have already explored how the massive wars that you hear about in gaming magazines are funded using everything from in-game casinos to war bonds. We have also explored how the game has its very own tax havens, and how they are causing the same kind of issues that tax havens do in the real world. EVE Online's economy is so large and complex that it truly does rival some small nations. What's more is that its systems are so realistic that they can genuinely be used to model real-world economic systems far more effectively than even the most expensive models used by governments, universities, and financial institutions. Part of this is by design, but it may not all be for the best. So it's time to learn how money works and see how the market system in EVE Online might have been too well designed for its own good. In an interview with the founder and CEO of EVE Online, it was revealed that the marketplace in EVE, where buyers and sellers will trade items, was actually copied off the Nasdaq. You see, way back in 2002 when this game was first being developed, the creators knew that enabling free and effective trade between players would be key to making the game truly immersive, as opposed to similar games at the time that relied primarily on trading with non-player controlled characters that would offer fixed predetermined prices. So, they needed to develop a system to make this happen. There was RuneScape, which offered its now legendary trade squares to players looking to exchange their wares. But the issue was that RuneScape servers were only home to a maximum of 2,000 players at a time, whereas EVE is hosted on a single server with a hypothetically unlimited amount of players. Trade was also not nearly as critical to day-to-day life in RuneScape as it was going to be in EVE Online. However, those trade squares did give the game developers some ideas. You see, the swarms of players shouting at each other the items they wanted to trade for what amount of money felt reminiscent of something: a stock trading floor. What they needed was a futuristic equivalent of this, something that could handle exchanges of more items more frequently without the need of players to shout at each other in one location. Fortunately, something like this did exist in the real world. It was the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq is a stock exchange, just like the New York Stock Exchange or any other stock exchange around the world. But at the beginning of the 21st century, it was fairly unique because it did not have a normal trading floor. In fact, all of its trades were handled digitally. This was especially impressive, considering the exchange first launched in 1971, which was well before most people had easy access to computers, and the internet was about as foreign to most people as the Large Hadron Collider is to us today. Either way, the Nasdaq efficiently and transparently displayed thousands of companies to millions of users, which was absolutely perfect for the developers of EVE Online. The market in the game looks like this. It lists bids and offers, quantities, how long the orders have been in the market, and what the trading price history of each individual item has been. This means that the market in EVE has a lot more in common with a stock exchange than it does, say, a trade window in most other RPGs. And this gives us a fantastic excuse to talk about market design. You see, we interact with markets all the time in our everyday lives. There are the obvious ones like firing up Robinhood to buy shares off the stock market, but also the ones that are more subtle by design. Take something like Uber Eats, for example. Now, something like Uber Eats is a fairly robust digital marketplace. It brings together hundreds of different sellers with millions of different buyers, and even has the added complexity of mixing the exchange of money and goods in with a service which is the delivery of those goods. Uber Eats has to present a lot of different information to a lot of different people, but it does selectively omit some of that information. There is no publicly available record of how much your butter chicken has sold for over time. There's also not a visible list of who is offering the lowest price for a cheeseburger, or a record of how many items traded when. All of these are features that may very well impact people's purchasing decisions, but ultimately, Uber Eats is a consumer marketplace. So, leaving this information out leads to more people just going, "Fuck it, I deserve this 1 AM kebab," which ultimately means more revenue for the businesses involved. This kind of deliberate market inefficiency also extends to our old RuneScape trade square. A potential buyer would have no way of knowing that the bow they are paying 10 gold for was being offered for sale by another player for 5 gold before they logged in. Likewise, that seller would have no way of knowing that there's someone on a different server that's willing to pay 15 gold, because this market system of shouting out bids and offers in one location at one time doesn't make that information available. Now, of course, given that the market in EVE Online was built off the model of a stock market, a type of market that craves access to information beyond all else, all of these limitations of these other examples are not present in this game. All of the players can access all of the information about trading history of all of the items in the game just by looking it up, if they are so inclined. This market efficiency is the foundation of the economy that all of these YouTubers, including myself, keep harping on about. Without a reliable way to effectively exchange essential goods, people would be forced into gathering those goods themselves. Without a market to facilitate exchange, you would find that if you wanted to fly a certain ship, you would have to go out and mine the materials to make the components to then build that ship. The same goes for all the modules that you would need to put on that ship. And in a game as large and dynamic as EVE Online, that could be a little bit intimidating. But because this market really is so efficient, it has allowed EVE players to become hyper-specialized, almost to a fault. You see, this market is so efficient and easy to work with that most players need to do very little to provide for themselves. They simply need to make as much money as possible in a short period of time as possible and use that money to buy anything they may need. While this type of role specialization is very useful in the real world, it's not exactly something that makes for a great video game which is supposed to be, you know, fun. Massively multiplayer online games tend to have a lot of very repetitive tasks simply by design. But when you combine this inherent grindiness with the push to specialize and trade, then things can go a bit too far. A common question EVE players will ask is how much ISK, the in-game currency, per hour an activity makes. This is exactly the same as asking how much you get paid per hour working at a job, only this time it's in a video game. The problem is that if a task in-game doesn't make enough money, then most players won't bother doing it, because they'd be better off spending their time on whatever does make them enough money. Now, this causes two major problems. The first is that it can make it very difficult for the game developers to introduce new features into the game, because if the feature does not generate enough profit for the players, it will mostly be ignored. And if it generates too much profit, then it will be relentlessly farmed day and night, destabilizing the wider economy. The second issue it causes is significant burnout amongst newer players. EVE Online is famous for having a very steep learning curve, and in the context of everything we have seen in this series, that makes sense. Imagine that you were a newborn baby and you knew nothing about the world and you were thrown out onto the streets and expected to find a high-paying job. Naturally, many players decide they are happy working just one job and give up after failing to carve out a piece of the incredibly competitive game for themselves. Now this is a real shame for two reasons. The first is that EVE really is a fantastic game once you get over the initial learning curve. There are people who've played the game for almost 20 years now and still enjoy logging in to see what this virtual world has to offer. But the second reason is that there are some tasks in the EVE economy that do need to get done, but won't be done by the more elite players. Think of these as the virtual space video game equivalent of minimum wage jobs. Great for people starting out, but if people are in these roles long term, you may have a problem with your economy. Anyway. On the opposite end of the spectrum from these entry-level jobs, the richest players in this game almost inevitably become market traders because it simply offers the highest possible level of income, assuming you have enough capital. These players will create multiple accounts in-game that don't even fly spaceships anymore. They simply sit in trade hubs across the virtual galaxy and trade in-game assets speculatively back and forth with one another. Some of the wealthiest of these traders have in-game assets that would be worth the equivalent of millions of real-world dollars, if only they were allowed to exchange them without breaking the game's rules, although this might actually be about to change according to the game's CEO. Either way, in a game that is famous for financial fraud, the reputation of these ultra-wealthy individuals is very important amongst their peers. Why? Because it allows them to borrow assets off each other. Why is this important? Because it allows them to short sell. The most famous example of this occurred when the changes to mining in the game were announced by the developers, which would make raw materials far more easy to extract. Now, normally you would expect that to push the price of these resources down, and this expectation was shared by most of the market speculators in the game at the time. So, those with the connections and resources to do so set up deals with large industrial entities to borrow strategic reserves of these raw materials, only to turn around and sell them straight on the open market. This meant that they could lock in the price that these materials were trading for while they were still very hard to mine in the game. It was hoped that after these changes, as more supply flooded the market, the price of these materials would drop where they could be purchased back at a lower price, returned to their original owner, and a nice healthy profit could be taken on the difference. This worked out pretty well for most of these traders, as the price of this in-game commodity did indeed fall to its lowest point ever, but the problem started when these speculators had to back out of their positions. The game developers slowly reversed the changes they had made to mining, which meant that materials became slightly harder to mine over time. This was combined with sweeping changes made to the game and a massive in-game war, so late last year, the price of this commodity almost doubled within the space of a month. This means that a lot of these wealthy long-term speculators were forced to cut their losses and close their positions before they went bankrupt. This resulted in one of the largest trading days in the game's history. A logical short position based on reasonable expectation of future decline being foiled by people playing on the internet? I wonder where I've heard that before. Now, you might ask, why didn't these speculators just not pay the people they borrowed off back? At the end of the day, scams in EVE are commonplace and widely accepted. Well, as we saw earlier, reputation is everything for the uber-rich in EVE Online. Sure, they might lose a few trillion ISK on this deal, but nobody would give them the facilities they needed to take short positions in the future, which would end up costing them a lot more. So yeah, I guess some players in EVE have an in-game credit score. Great. Nevertheless, most players in EVE were blissfully unaware of this going on at all, as they continued to bury their heads in their own in-game jobs and carve out a living in the most realistic virtual economy ever created. Now, this was the third and potentially final installment in my series on the financial system of EVE Online. I will leave a link to the other two videos in the description. Once again, I would like to thank the players and the staff that run this game for offering up such great suggestions to research and make a video on. If you also enjoyed these topics, please consider liking and subscribing to keep on learning how money works.